I think I covered this slide yesterday, but I'll just go through it because the last that I was talking about was a very recent, the approach that the data, what we are, the contemporary talks that we are having as far as heritage management is concerned, where we talk about living heritage approach. So where we talk about the intangible and tangible, the entire, within the framework of the historic urban landscape. So ICROM also talks about it in a different way. It says it people-centered approach. So from going from the monument-centric approach where we were only talking about preservation, restoration to adaptive reuse, we have now come down to this value-based to living heritage approach. Niti Aayog, then you should look up this document. It's a very interesting document on improving heritage management in India, a very huge document which actually talks about the status of heritage management in India and the way forward and what can be done. So here also they talk about the living heritage and its dynamism needs to be recognized and addressed appropriately while providing a management framework for India's heritage. Intact also talks about it in its Intact is a NGO, non-governmental organization, but which works with a lot of documentation and safeguarding of living heritage, especially the ones which are not under the Archaeological Survey of India. And it also talks about the living heritage in its charter, which it developed in 2004. So living heritage, basically the main concept becomes the continuity, in particular the continuity of the heritage site's original function or the purpose for which they are originally intended, and the continuity of the community connection. So as Sophia Labadi, who is a well-known conservation person who talks about that, stop considering heritage as static and authentic. So this is where I actually had talked about, authenticity and how that can be actually questioned. Especially when intangible comes into the picture. And also continuity is the core of what heritage management that we talk about. Culture as key to sustainable development has also come about because culture was never part of the sustainable development, and it took a lot of years for discussions with by a lot of experts for it to come into the 2030 United Nations agenda. So now culture is actually considered the fourth pillar. You have the socio-cultural, you have the economic, you have the environmental, and you have culture as a fourth pillar, because then it is taken up as enabler for social cohesion, inclusion, and equity. Cultural heritage and historic quarters of the cities are taken up for livability and sustainability of urban areas, and cultural heritage and creativity is considered as an enabler for increasing the effectiveness of the development interventions in urban areas. These are some questions which were put up by UNESCO in 2008, but they are as relevant today also when we actually talk about management in historic areas, where we the first will be the balance that can will need to be created between development and competitiveness. So the more contemporary development that we talk about, the competitiveness that you have with contemporizing things, and how it can be aligned with the rights and needs of the community. Second is how to safeguard the built fabric as well as the traditions in the historic areas. Because like I already showed you that, the built fabric is deteriorating a lot, and it also has to do with the deterioration of the intangible side of this areas. So how all these can be, taken together and how it can be safeguarded. Now, today the word that we also use, intangible, has also brought about this word called safeguarding, because initially it was always about preserving and restoration as far as buildings and monuments are concerned. But now when we talk about intangible component coming into the picture, when we look at the way forward part of it, because of its continuity part of it, because of its evolving side of it, safeguarding is a word which is used where you actually try to safeguard it by including the fact that it is going to be a continuous process. So that word has also emerged because of the intangible. Urban fabric be restored without halting the development of cultures or destroying natural resources. Social cohesion be ensured by managing the pressures of property owners and the need for socio-cultural mix. And sustainable revitalization projects be successfully carried out with appropriate expertise and means. So you can always look at these questions again when you look at the presentations, but they do have a lot of relevance even today. So that this has been the crux of the questions, where you say that inclusion of socio-cultural and economic parameter, issue of safeguarding versus conservation, and issue of continuity and change, which is which has to be taken into consideration. These are some of the existing outreach things where you have the adaptive reuse. So this was a Haveli which has been adaptively reused. So it also has economic connotation to it. At the same time, it can be restored and conserved for the future. This is another kind of outreach. This thing where this is part of the Narayan Nivas, which is also a villa which is outside Jaipur, but this is a new part which has been actually built, and they are basically boutiques in a way, very high-end boutiques of craft. So especially this guy Ayush Katsriwal, he works a lot with the local craftsmen and gets products made, and they are made by the craftsmen. They are finished in his factory, and then they are sold here. And they are also exported a lot and everything. So it's very good that this does lead to the economic augmentation of the craft people and the intangible heritage. But the only problem is the craftsmen do not have any exposures to it. So that is also why the historic areas actually need to be, more looked at, because that is where the craftsmen also can actually come in contact with the customers also, or the people who are going to, be the beneficiaries of these crafts. This, like I said, that this is, different the things. They have taken this facade they have got from somewhere in Rajasthan, and that facade was being thrown away by somebody. So these people have brought it here, and it has been, reinstituted here. So in a way, it is good that, instead of being thrown away, it was being reused. But then this is also like a Disneyfication, in the sense that, you try to Disneyfy a place which is not actually existing. But all said and done, I'm just trying to put you different perspectives of what are the different things that is happening. This is the Narayan Nivas, which is at the back, which is the historical place. In the COVID situation, that entire scenario has changed, and we have now gone into totally virtual tours. We don't even have access to the place in itself. So everything is, even we have performances, we have traditional craft which is being sold online. We have tours of different heritage sites which we do online. So this entire scenario has, been totally changed in a case of this new thing. Hriday is, I'm just mentioning it because this is one scheme of, or the program of the government, which has actually got many successful examples also. And there has a lot of bending towards the heritage, revitalization and livelihoods. So it actually talked about, mapping of the intangible and the tangible heritage of cities, revitalization, which was linked to the service provisions, and knowledge management, skill development was part of it. And so this is one of very good example of how it can be actually taken forward to it. So this comes. So I'm just putting down some thoughts for the way forward, where we say that the review and redefining the ICH and the local values, the rituals, to make meaningful within the framework of tangible heritage is what is important. Planning decisions, heritage legislation should be based on ICH and local values, with the community connecting to the SDGs, because that is what is very important. In fact, this is part of a paper which I'm trying to write, where we are saying that, all the legislations should be based on, ICH local values also, because now till today it is all based on, experts' opinion, and you have these closed door meetings where these things are actually taken up. So the community should be there, and then we are connecting it to the SDGs. This is also very important because the 73rd and the 74th amendments to the Constitution mandate a role for the public in the decision-making process, while the 42nd Constitutional Amendment states it's a fundamental duty and responsibility of every citizen to value and preserve the rich heritage of our composite culture. So this is the end of that last that was there, and I'll come down to the topic of today. Can you still hear me?
Yes, madam.
Yeah. Okay. I'm a little worried this time. Okay. So yeah, so heritage in the context of disasters. So why we are looking at it and what implication it has on it. I don't know whether some of you will recognize this picture. This picture actually comes from the Beirut blast. So where 60 historical buildings were, destroyed or damaged to an extent, and this is part of one of the old quarters where you can actually see the damages. As part of the thing that happened. This is a Colosseum, a very, very important site in Rome, and it is full of people. It is impossible to actually move around without, you coming face to face with people. Like you can see a picture from before 2020, and this is a picture which I took last month, which where you can see that there are hardly any people there. So, what are we looking at and what are the impacts? COVID in itself, if I just talk about COVID, then yeah, definitely it had a very strong health impact. And even when we talk about disaster management, it's always about human first. So, definitely we talk about the humans as when we have to talk about the risk management and who are we saving. It's always a human first, but then after that, what are we looking at? What are the impacts of this entire thing? Is it only the health issue that is impacted? No, it's also about these cultural heritage which is impacted, and through this cultural heritage there are a lot of other things which get impacted. So you have the hospitality industry, you have the restaurants, you have the tourism people, the entire fleet of flights which are impacted. The souvenir shops are impacted. The craft people have been a lot of impacted. So the entire economy also gets into a toss. At the same time, the cultural identity and these things also get into question, because you are not able to interact with different kind of people. There has been fragmentation of social systems also, because you have not the kind of culture that everybody had their own, especially if you talk about Italians, it was always a culture of meeting each other. Even in India, I think we are much more about this, that we keep on, if you have to talk with a neighbor or other people, and we keep on interacting with people, we keep on interacting with our family. But now today that has stopped because we are not able to do so. So this implication of disasters of any kind of a hazard, it's not necessary it is only on one side. It has got multi facets to it, and that's what the whole thing is about. This is a building in Chandigarh. This was designed by Le Corbusier. It's part of the Punjab University, and it's a very, very important building. It's an administrative building, so it actually has records of all the exams and certificates and results and everything. And this was something which we studied with my students in Chitkara University. We studied and we made it was exhibited for 15 days, and the registrar also came and we told him about a lot of issues with this building, and after 6 months, this is what happened. So it was within a span of 6 months. So this was the study that we had done, where we had actually talked about a lot of inherent weaknesses also how it was actually being used also including the density, because obviously this building was made in the 1960s, and the number of people that they were expecting and the number of people who are working there today is very different. So all these things, and there are many other things which actually put this into a big risk zone. And yeah, so in 6 months, this was the situation which happened. And this was the same room which we had, and you can see how it has turned out in 6 months. This is another building by which we did not have to pay rent for around 6 months, because it's in Chandigarh. It actually housed electricity billing and other things, and so 6 months a lot of citizens were happy because there was no bills, and then later on we had to pay everything together. So but yeah, all these buildings, we did not have any human casualty, thankfully, because it was in the night time, but the heritage was totally on fire. So the presentation basically talks about understanding disasters, heritage and disasters, and disaster risk management of cultural heritage. Culture cannot wait. This is a tagline from Ikram's course on international training on first year to cultural heritage, where they say that culture will not be able to wait till you actually wake up and start working with it. So it will have to be a proactive thing. So because why we are talking about this is for the basic notion that disaster risk management field has come to. Initially, it was always about that, there was a catastrophe which struck, there was an earthquake or something, and we used to respond to it till the last century. I'm not talking about the century, but centuries before. So we used to respond to it. In fact, till the time that 17th century and before, they used to say that it was an act of God, and we have to, accept it in a way. But today the discussion is all about being proactive. So you doing things which before. So it's not about reacting, but it is about being proactive, doing things before things happen. So now most of these heritage buildings, especially the World Heritage sites and even the other state heritage buildings, have a chapter which actually talks about disaster risk management as part of that heritage management process. So that entire chapter has to be, incorporated within. A very, very famous, last the same example that we have the Notre Dame, which the fire started in one of these things at 9:50, and by 7:53, so that's in less than 2 hours, the entire this fire it came down, and then you also had this roof coming down, mainly because it happened in such a place that it was impossible to know beforehand. So, and I think they're still trying to work with it. Notre Dame Cathedral not yet totally saved 6 months after devastating fire. Now, when we look at these cultural buildings, they are not only as I mentioned, because they are all living heritage. So they are the buildings where people actually come every day. They offer prayers, and it is this I mentioned yesterday about Ukelito, where he says that it is not about the presence of God that it's more about how the community accepts it, that there is God present in this building, and that is how we work with this building. That is what the identity is. So this building is the identity for all the French people. It is the identity for all the religious people who come here to worship every day. It is also an identity for all the tourists who actually come here, especially to see the Notre Dame. So when you talk about the devastation of a cultural heritage, it is never about the building in itself. So all these things also have to be taken into consideration. There are different kinds of disasters. This is earthquake, the bushfires. This is a very beautiful and important site of World Heritage Site of Olympia in Greece, where and now they have tried to put this back into some kind of system. You have Edinburgh, where there was a fire, and it was a lot of important areas were burnt down. It was an old entire vicinity. This if people who are from, especially the architect or the archaeology department, would actually know that this is a site which is the most important Adobe site of the world. So that is Adobe is basically what is made from the earth or mud. And it was the most important because it was the largest site, and it had a citadel also. You can actually see the fort also, and you can actually see the houses below. But this is what happened in earthquake 2003, and the reason why it happened had to do with earthquake, but it also had to do with the fact that there were a lot of interventions which were done here. So it's not always about nowadays when we talk about as risk management experts, we always say that most of the disasters which happen, they are all human induced, mainly because, like, if I talk about this kind of building, then earlier, if most of the buildings were made in lime mortar and those kind of materials, and they were very traditional material which was relevant for that place. Later on, we have people have started using other contemporary materials within that only, which actually doesn't work. And so that is why this happens when the building is not able to take the new interventions. The war, Iraq war, We know all this, the Uttarakhand tragedy, the Kedarnath floods, which happened in 2013, and everybody, says that, it is a miracle that the temple survived. So maybe there is a third force to it, but the main part that the building survived is also because of the traditional systems or the traditional building materials and the traditional way of building, which are very, very important and which are very resistant to many kinds of earthquake and any other disasters also. That is also what has been proved in a lot of study done by many experts also. So it has actually to do with the traditional building systems and not so much to do with just the third force that we talk about. The Mumbai terror attack 26th November, which we never knew that, this was also going to be part of our history actually. And, even though security has always been part of any kind of hotels, but it was always about theft and, those kind of simple things. Terrorism was not something which actually came into the picture. UNESCO also comes up, helps or supports with these kind of things, whenever it comes up, because either it helps with the expert missions or it offers its solidarity, and it sometimes also gets funds together for helping, depending on the kind of nation that they are looking at. This is another problem that we are facing very lately, climate change, which is in fact another entire subject in itself, but I'm just mentioning here so that we know what are the different disasters that we are looking at. So Venice last year was totally in news because of so much floods, in all its shops, also in the shops which were owned by, all big designers. And so it was quite news, the thing which had come about. And so this is also one thing that, climate change is one thing which we are actually looking at. And climate change is one problem which is a very progressive kind of a disaster. So when you actually talk about typology of disaster, there can be, momentary disasters, like you have these earthquakes, you have the floods and other things which happen for, the moment, or it can be for a day or something, a cloudburst, avalanche. And then you also have these progressive ones that you don't realize that they are going to come up. They over the time, all of a sudden you realize that, this was because of, maybe one was the reason because of that. And we all are, talking about it. So everybody is talking about it, but yeah, nobody is doing anything about it as such. So what is a disaster? So basically, disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. So it basically, anything which exceeds our ability to cope with it is what actually leads to a disaster. WHO also has its own, definition, and obviously it relates more to health. But that also basically looks at the same thing, that till we something that we are not able to cope within our community or within a certain region or within our infrastructure is what we actually would term as disaster. So the changing paradigm has been that from looking at it from technocentric paradigm of seeing disasters as events, something which just happened, a social perspective of seeing it as a phenomena. Like I said, that we are not now looking at it as, something which just happened and it affects that building or that region in itself, maybe geographically or physically, but we also look at it in a phenomena in the sense of a wider perspective of the social cultural background also of how it will get impacted. So what causes this disaster? Mainly, it can be this catastrophic events, which we call a term as hazards in technical terms. So you have earthquake, volcanic, meteorological, hydrological, biological, technological, socio-anthropologic, terrorism, political conflict, war, explosion, fire, chemical release, looting, vandalism, all kinds of, so human induced also and natural also. But it's not only about, these things which actually happen. What are the other things? You also have something like these slow and progressive agents of damage. So you have, something like these weathering over the time, some kind of insects that can actually come. These are all about intangible, cultural heritage. So you have the vegetation which has been growing over the years and maintenance was not done. Discoloration can happen in costumes which are there in the museums, and insects or other things can be part of the same. Weathering and salinity over the time, depending on if there's some kind of a water seepage somewhere, and then you have these weatherings which can happen over the time. And, biological decay is also part of it. Now, and these are the things which are progressive hazards. So they actually happen over the time and they don't realize all of a sudden. When we talk about something like a museum, this is a museum that we actually, the last one where we put forward the disaster risk management plan. I will also just take a second to talk about that. When we say disaster management, we always put it as disaster risk management. The reason why we say it is that this entire activity or this entire exercise that we do is only about trying to reduce the risk. I cannot in any way, do anything about the floods. I cannot do anything thing as far as the heavy rain is concerned, even though that has also come out because of climate change and because of a lot of our own issues that we have created. But also earthquake. So we can't do much about those things, but we can definitely reduce the risk which can happen because of them. So that is why this entire exercise is not about disaster management. It's basically about disaster risk management, managing the risk of what can happen because of these hazards. So if I look at a museum, there's the important hazards can also be water seepage. It can be direct sunlight penetration. It can be theft possibility also. It can be vandalism, uncontrolled temperature. Now here the theft possibility would also be a major disaster, because if you have 3 or 4 paintings which are actually stolen, that becomes a major disaster. You actually hear from time to time of how things have been stolen and they come up in the other part of the world and they are sold again. So this was just from one of the presentations which we made about looking at how these water parts, these blue ones are, because it's a old building, it's a very sturdy building, but then since it has been many years, you have these water seepage coming from various parts at these blue portions. And this is one of the artifacts, even though it is in stone, it had to be covered because there was a continuous trickling of water which was happening on top of it. So how do these agents convert themselves into disasters? That can be also because of physical weakness. Either the building was inherently, there was some weakness to that building. Urban transformations. Now, this is a picture actually from Nepal, but this is a kind of scenario that we are expecting in places like Delhi also, and a lot of historic areas also, considering that it can actually have a lot of vulnerability to earthquakes, and then you have a lot of these buildings which get reconstructed. Each building is on its own. And in this case, it's never about whether your building is strong. Even if I do construct my building with all the right things, the right techniques and the retrofitting and the earthquake resistance, make it an earthquake resistant structure, it can always have a pounding effect, in the sense that if another building collapses, then the other buildings also get affected as a pounding effect, like the pack of cards that you can put one after the other and they get affected by each other. So that is also very important, that has to be seen, because it also has multiple ownership. So you have a lot of these other people, everybody makes their own changes which might or might not work with the traditional systems which already existed, and how it can work. And this is what it can lead to: lack of bylaws also, because I think if anybody is from the engineering department, they will realize the kind of construction which is done, it doesn't adhere to the bylaws which are needed. Human interventions, like I said, wrong repairs. If we talk about having lime mortar and then you actually start working with the new concrete mortar, then it's not going to work. Now, vandalism, a very, very problematic issue that we have everywhere, I think. Earthquake and slides, and so this is basically about exposure to hazards due to the location. So even though the other things are there, the most important is also because if there is an exposure to any kind of hazard. So when we start working with the disaster management plans, we actually start looking at the first the exposure of this site to whichever hazards it has. So if my site is near the river, or whether it is near the ocean, then it might have something in that kind of order. Or if it is, comes on the earthquake, in the earthquake belts and seismic zones, then it could have the exposure to that. There's a differential this is the picture from 2001 Gujarat earthquake, where one building was standing, the other has fallen up because the soil check must not have been done, and that could be the problem. Now, this is a very, very interesting example of cultural heritage where we as technology are not able to, work very well. And that is why it says that since our technological methods are limited with many unpredictable factors, we'd rather keep them buried. This is why this is a army of terracotta warriors that was found earth in China, and they dug it up, and it was an amazing discovery of so many thousands of sculptures of terracotta warriors So when they actually dug it up, they realized that this there was a decay which was happening very fast due to this new atmospheric that they had gotten into. So now then later on they actually built this entire cover that you can actually see on the top, which has a very controlled temperature and a very controlled system of putting all these things here. But still there is a problem of decay. It's not able to, even though for so many years or centuries it must have remained intact, once it got dug up, there is a problem of decay which is happening. And so that is why we are saying that even with the technological thing, it would have been maybe buried would have kept them alive. So the deterioration phenomena can be different. Lack of maintenance, lack of funds, lack of will is always the problem that we have. If I look at simple examples like this gallery which we had in that museum, even existing conditions, like even just put where these extinguishers are located. Like if you see this one here where there's no access to go, this one which is at the back of this exhibit, which I can't see, and in fact if during some kind of a fire or something I rush towards it, then I might actually topple this exhibit, and I'm going to create more damage than otherwise. So this existing conditions also have to be looked at, of how things can be put in such a way that the accessibility is very strong. The existing security systems also here, in fact, 40% of the cameras were not actually working also, and then due to the placement of it, you had a lot of these, the red zones which were created, which did not have, monitoring. So they also are as important. So I'm also talking about that, the existing systems also will need to be taken into picture. Other factors, incorrect temperature, incorrect humidity, weathering, dissociation, pollution, crystallization of stone, pest, vegetations, all these become part of it. Okay, so the reasons why this is actually get converted into disasters are basically, when you identify the hazard, it can be actually the physiology of the hazard or its peculiar characteristics. That is, if it's an earthquake, then what are its characteristics? How does it, work? And whether, because when you talk about the earthquake, then it actually works from ground below. And so that's a different way of then how a floods will work. The impact and probability of the occurrence of how, what is the time of, because every, most of the disasters are also looked at its history of occurrence. So, and how impactful they can be. So when you actually look into disaster management plan, we also look at the fact that what is the history of it and how it is, can develop, how many times did it happen? The elements by affecting whether it is life and property or environment likely to be affected. So who is actually going to be affected more or less, or how? If I give you a simple example of the one which I showed earlier when we talk about the administrative building. In that building, thankfully, because it happened at night, there was nobody there, and so there was no loss of life. But because it's such an important building, there was a lot of loss of records. which was something which could not be replaced also to an extent. So that is also where, so it also will depend on what is getting affected, because ultimately disaster risk management is also a economically expensive exercise. So you also have to look at the fact that when you are talking about the building, the one is also about its cultural value of it, and at the same time also what it houses, what is that within. So when you talk about a cultural building, it never becomes only about what is within it, but it is also about the building. So there we were talking about the building which was actually designed by Le Corbusier. It is part of the legacy of Chandigarh, and to add to it, we had the issues of the results and the records and other things. So all these things become, part of the values that we will have to consider when we consider disaster risk management for. In same in the case of museum also, because in museums it becomes multifold. You actually are talking about the building also in itself, and that which is also part of the Le Corbusier series. In fact, there are 3 museums of the same kind. One is in Ahmedabad, one is in Japan, and one is here. So 3 of these museums which are designed by Corbusier, and this is the second of that. And it's also that it houses the artifacts and arts from the time before independence, because this museum has a lot of things which actually came from the Lahore Museum of Arts. Some of the artifacts were distributed between the 2 countries, and some of them came here. So all these things actually become a significant part of it. Now, there is a reason why I'm talking about this, that if I talk about a simple thing, a Chile earthquake, which had a magnitude of 8.8, and it killed 723 people, and this is the devastation that it had. It had a lot of devastation as far as historical buildings are also concerned. This is a Haiti earthquake. It was a magnitude less than that, 7, but it killed 230,000 people. And this is the devastation that it talks about. So why did it happen? What is the basic difference between, the 2 of them? So the basic difference is the characteristics and the circumstances of the community, system, and asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of hazards. Now, I had done a study of Haiti. So if you look at Haiti as example, because of the majority damage that it had, it has a lot of problem with its political instability over the years. It is a history of political instability, and that also makes it more prone to having bylaws which have been flaunted a lot. Overall, also it's the economy of the country is very low, and because of the political instability, there were not many governing laws, bylaws, systems in place which could actually work better. And also the buildings which were part of this entire system. So the vulnerability can actually come up from every place. It can be physical, which I talked about before. Also, it can be physical weaknesses of the building. It can be something to do with social also. It can be economic also. It can be environmental issues also, and even it can be attitudinal factors also. Because if we take one example from southern, I think south part, if I'm not mistaken. This is a post-disaster in some cyclone that we talk about. So there was also this, there are also cultural issues which can come about. So there was food being distributed quite a lot. In fact, there's a lot of support which definitely comes about when disaster strikes. So, and then after some time, people started realizing that there were a lot of these women who were not actually getting food, and they were going hungry. The problem finally was realized that, because of that cyclone and whatever the tragedy, the disaster which had happened, they had lost all the burqas that they used to wear, Muslim women. And because of that, they were not able to go out to get that food when it was being distributed. So that was the first thing which was actually given. So at that time, it is about that cultural identity also, which is very important. It's not only about, looking at the buildings and trying to keep them safe. So these things also have to be, taken into consideration. So ultimately, we land up where we have a hazard. So where we look at the intensity and the probability, you have the vulnerability, which is the socio-economic, ecological values, the susceptibility of that site, of how much what can happen to it, its exposure, and the risk, the probability of the social, economic, and ecological damages that can actually lead to, like I already showed you in the example of New Zealand and Haiti, that difference in the level of damages which can happen. So the risk in case of Haiti is much more because of the different, lot of these socio-economical, political, physical, other vulnerabilities which are inherent within it, and also because it has an exposure to this earthquake belt, because it's already on the earthquake, the seismic zone. So all these bring it together to how much risk it can actually have. So when we talk about disaster, it can and a risk to disaster, it can be actually risk of disaster. So if I look at a site, then I start by understanding what are the risks which are there to this site, and I also look at what are the disasters which can actually happen from the what are the risks which can happen from the disaster also. So in a very simple example, if I talk about that, if I talk about this any kind of a building, which I think we'll talk about example from the Egyptian political upsurge, which happened some years back. There was this main square, and there was a lot of political upsurge. So people were out in the open and protesting against the government and everything. So that there was a museum near to that, and there was already, so that place had already a risk of these people coming together, and the disaster which happened because there were a lot of looting and other things which happened. And because of that entire political upsurge, and because of they put fire to buildings and other things, the museum which was very close by, there was a lot of looting which was done from that also. So there was one issue which was about the political instability, which also can be taken as a disaster, mainly because of the scale of it. And then you also have that there is a secondary effects which happen because of that, which are not actually originally, which we would not have anticipated, but then they do happen. Sometimes it is also that you have flooding at some places, and after that flooding, there is an epidemic because of the sludge which gets left out. So that is also, so it's also after the disaster strikes, what are the risks which actually comes because of that disaster. So both these things have to be taken into consideration. So disaster mitigation is one of the key components of disaster management systems, and disaster resilience is a capacity to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from the impacts of disaster. I hope I'm still audible here. Just checking. Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I'll come down to why should DRM become important for cultural heritage properties. So it's very important because it's for the natural and the community pride, for its social cohesion, for the identity that we talked about before also. It also supports vulnerable communities by preserving their heritage. The traditional knowledge systems embodied in the physical planning and construction, local management systems, and ecology are very much important to mitigate the impact of disaster. In fact, some of the studies, especially if you look at the Gujarat earthquake, which was studied a lot over the years, you find that the traditional knowledge systems, the traditional building systems have been much more effective in case of resisting earthquake than the more contemporary buildings. So in fact, building contemporary buildings in Ahmedabad, they fell like a pack of cards, and while the buildings which were in Saurashtra, the traditional buildings, they survived much better. So even that, the same case in Nepal also, a lot of these temples and other things survived. Some of them which had a problem was also mainly because of the lot of repairs and other things which were done over the time. The ecological system also, if you look at the Madras, the Chennai floods, if you look at the Kashmir floods, Kashmir was part of these many lakes which were connected in somehow to each other, over the time, historically. So the water, when it overflows, it shifts from here to, to other places. Now, because of our urbanization, we have, cut that natural system. Same thing in Chennai. Chennai had initially, I think, 425 or something water bodies, and which have now reduced to around 150 or 125 of them. And that led to the Chennai floods of, I think, 2014, if I'm not mistaken, or somewhere around there, which was a huge, a problem, and which actually the flood was not the only problem. After the floods, you have other diseases which come into this. So the other risk which actually come because of that disaster. So the traditional systems are very important that to maintain. Cultural properties are very important as safe havens for surrounding communities for the temporary relocation during emergencies. Many temples, many mosques, other places are taken up as heavens for these. Earthquake, floods, oil spills, and other thing outbreak cannot be entirely prevented, but mitigation measures can reduce the risk that can be present. And these disasters do have great financial consequences. So obviously, a lot of money, which the state money, gets shifted to trying to rework on that. And so that is why it is very important that it's always better to be proactive instead of reactive to it and then again using that same money. So reducing the risk is the most effective management approach. What is our current level of preparedness? And that is why we are actually discussing this topic also. If you look at the reports of conservation reports of 2012, this basically actually looks at more or less the World Heritage Sites because that has been part of it. So if you look at the majority of this risk are not even identified within the management document. This is also with the fact that, this idea of making it into a risk management document has to be separately put up has not been a very old system. It has been part of a recent system, but still we have 37 of the percent of the world properties which are not even where the risk is identified, and there are 30% which actually where the risk has been identified, but there is no concrete plans or any reference to mitigating these. So all these are actually a total risk of waiting for disaster to happen, and where we are saying that culture cannot wait for us to take action later on. So the paradigm shift. So now we are looking at identification of the present condition to assessing potential impacts in the future and developing scenarios. So now our entire exercise, which is a separate subject in itself, but it all becomes of how we can anticipate what can happen. So if I look at this museum also, then I started looking at what are the places where a fire can happen. If a fire can happen, after the fire, what will happen? If the security system doesn't work, then if somebody enters, then how will it work? So you need to create scenarios and think in that way. So you have to think about the risks which are of the future and in the present. Prioritizing based on the potential impact on heritage values besides people, lives, and livelihoods, from reactive conservation in response to problems to preventive care and management, and reducing risk by reducing vulnerabilities and exposure of cultural heritage to hazards. Urbanization is also a very, very important problem that everybody is shifting to the city, and we have this major problem. And this was also one reason why Kathmandu had a lot of issue as far as when this earthquake happened. So because there were a lot of transformations. One of the photographs which I showed you before also, you had a lot of these different people building their houses one against each other. Also, these were the buildings which were, there was a lot of retrofitting and other things were also obviously because weathering over the time which has happened, which were done. And because of the way it was done, even during this time when the earthquake happened, the system became so weak that that the fire services were not able to gain access, and evacuation of the inhabitants and visitors became very difficult. Because the urban planning has also changed. The traditional planning systems, which was actually more open to an extent, that also has changed over the time. So the kind of urban transformations which I talked about before, the ecology system which I was talking about, the urbanization. So these are the kind of water bodies that we talk about. So when you talk about cultural heritage, it is physical on the built form. So it can affect the built form, it can affect the values, very, very important, loss of world history, and affecting the traditional knowledge systems. where if I put it in other ways, it will be lives and livelihoods. So visitors, staff, local community, components of heritage that is built in archaeological remains, collections, landscape elements, intangible aspects and other systems. In fact, a lot of these intangible crafts are also diminishing over the time because of the recurring, like if you talk about Bengal, if you talk about South India, a lot of floods and these things, they keep on recurring over the time, and they do suffer a lot of losses, and that also leads to them being diminishing over the time. Setting of heritage site. So it's not only about like I said, when we talk about the living heritage, it's not only about the site in itself or the monument in itself, it's also about the surrounding of it. So it can this can also affect the surrounding itself. So if I talk, especially if you talk about, take an example of Nepal, then it's about these temples which are around each other, and then you have the community which is around which stay around each other, and the way they interact with each other, their identity, their traditional systems of water spouts which are around them. So all these setting also actually gets impacted, and that can have a long-lasting impact on the total cultural systems that they adopt over the time. Risk to heritage values of the site. So degree of potential loss of values associated with various attributes of the site. And so basically the first step is a value assessment for your heritage site. As I already gave the example that when I talk about the museum, it would be different. When I talk about the administrative building, it would be different. When I talk about some kind of a monument, it would be different. So if it is just a monument site, then it could be basically about the building in itself, and then it will also depend on what is the significance of the building. If I talk about some kind of a temple or something, it will be very different, because it will be about the identity of the people also and the community who are around, as well as the architectural and the scientific and the historical value of that building. So that assessment is very important. The values embodied in cultural heritage are identified in order to assess significance, prioritize resource. I'm just putting this again because that whole thing has, in as far, even when you talk about heritage management, or whether you talk about heritage risk management, the same thing comes about again. So it's recognized that values may compete or change over time, and that heritage may have different meanings for different stakeholders also, because sometimes buildings also do change. Like if the example where I showed you, where I talked about that there was originally a small I think it was a haveli, which has now actually converted into a museum. So originally the value was different. It was a value of the people who were actually staying there. Today the value is different, because it is the building value, the historical value remains, but the value is now adds on to the museum artifacts which are actually there, and which also have a historical background to it, because they have been collected from various parts of Rajasthan, and they have been put together here. And it also gives a scientific story about how this evolution of the costumes happened in this part of the area region. So all these things also do take into consideration. So the critical challenge of mainstreaming of heritage would be actually that when you talk about heritage conservation and management, it will have to include disaster management and climate change adaptation, and it would have to include all these people together. So you will talk about public transport, you talk about housing, you talk about land use planning, how you are going to, because Chennai floods actually did show that, in fact, one of the prominent institutes that has been actually put up on a reclaimed land, a land which was actually originally a waterbed. So on that water body, the land was filled up, and this institution has come about, and because of when the floods occurred, then it was not able to take the impact of it. So what kind of a land use are we looking at, and whether we are going to totally disturb the ecological system of this area. The different kind of services which are going to come into picture. When I talked about Nepal, I said that even the simple things as fire services during the time of disaster is very important, that it's able to negotiate. And environmentally, Uh, I'm just mentioning this here because Sendai framework is, in a way, the only framework at international level which actually looks into, putting some kind of the entire framework on how to, deal with disaster risk reduction. So it has these. It was put up in 2015, and it talks about understanding disaster risk, then strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response, and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So earlier, when we talk about recovery, we always used to talk about, you say something like you recover, so you come back. But then when you recover, it's never going to be the original, that we are looking at. So it's always about you are recovering to the better state that you can. So that is what. So that this catchphrase "build back better" has been, and coming up nowadays when we talk about recovery and rehabilitation, much because it basically tries to say that how much, at what level are you going to come back. So this entire thing finally comes down to being resilient, whether it is a community, whether it is whether we are talking about people, whether we are talking about a monument, whether we are talking about an entire region or entire town like the Kathmandu, as far as Nepal is concerned. So now the issue is of what are we looking at for, of what resilience, to what resilience, and by whom resilience. So I'll give you an example by, this building, everybody knows it's a Pentagon. So here the resilience that we are looking at is not as earthquake. Here the resilience is about the security. So here, if I talk about the risk management, I'm going to look at security. There is something called that cyber security, because they always have this hacking question that always come into news and other things. So here the resilience of the building is going to be something entirely different from this. This is bungas. These are very famous. This have become more famous because of the earthquake which happened later in 2001. Because this is one typology of traditional systems which, because it's a circular building, and the kind of structure that is made, it has been a very, very strong, resilient, earthquake resilient example for everybody to look at. So here the resilience is different. It is a resilience to earthquake. It is resilience to wind, strong winds. It is resilience to strong, the sun exposure. So here the resilience is different. Now, these are the three world most resilient cities, where you have Copenhagen, Barcelona, and Curitiba, where Curitiba has been actually put up as a poster city for urban resilience in 2016 by the World Bank. But what resilience are we looking at? Here it talks about the financial resilience, life quality, and security. So it's very important to also look at that, what risk are we looking at, and the risk can not be only the the natural and induced events or hazards. It can be a lot of other things also. So that brings us to capacity, because capacity is what is actually going to support us to become more resilient. So capacity is a combination of all the strength, attributes, and resources available within organization, community, and society to manage and reduce disaster risk and strengthen resilience. So it can be human resource, physical resource, natural resources, political resources. Definitely, you need a very strong framework. In India, we have the National Institute of Disaster Management, and we also have the NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, who are the ones who actually look after this. That one actually works for how things are going to be happen when play out when disaster strikes, and you have NIDM, which actually looks into capacity building of human resources for working towards this time. Economic resources, very important. New Zealand and Haiti are a very strong example of that, of all these different resources also, where things do change. Social resources. So if I look at the entire this in one frame, it's basically I look at a hazard or a natural, which can be natural or human induced. Even though it's earthquake, we always say it's more of a human induced, mainly because the vulnerability which actually comes within the part of that building is what actually leads to a disaster. The earthquake doesn't lead directly to a disaster, but this vulnerability of inherent, whether it is a physical weakness, whether it was bylaws which were not in place, whether there was no strong framework which was there for working with the traditional buildings. So all these things can be, and the capacity of how much the resources that we have to actually lower these vulnerabilities over the time are the ones which will lead us to this disaster. Right. So if I am talking about building on a hill, if you talk about the Uttarakhand, the biggest problem was not the catastrophic cloudburst which happened and the floods which happened. It was mainly about the kind of infrastructure which was being developed. It's every area has a carrying capacity of how much it can take as far as buildings are concerned. But because it was a tourism area, there were so many buildings which were made over the time, and which was not possible that, and the construction was also very speedily done because everybody wanted just hotels where people can be taken up and it can be used for tourism for maximum economic beneficial. And so that is why this so that was main reason for the disaster which actually happened. So when we look into a risk management cycle, we normally look at what are the preventions before disasters, what can be done during disasters, how the response can be, after disaster, what recoveries can be. So if I talk about the museums, then I'm going to look at that, how one is obviously the human first, and then at the same time, I'm also going to see that how recoveries of the artifacts can be done. So for me, both these things will be as important in my recovery plan. I'm coming to my last slide, which basically puts all these together, saying that the context, which is the system or the process, you have the disturbance, it's a shock and the processes, the resilience to what hazard that we are looking at, capacity to deal with the disturbance, so it's exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity that the region, the place, monument has. And depending on all that, it will finally come down to whether we bounce back better, whether we are just able to bounce back, whether we recover, but worse than before, or whether we totally collapse. So I'm talking about whether we, as a building, as a region, as a area, a cultural site. So what level are we going to get back? That will actually come from the first through things which should be in place as far as the place is concerned. Thank you so much, and I think I have tried to complete before, so that if there are any questions, then I would be very happy to take them up.